Okay, hello. My name's Nadia.
And my name's Barbara.
How was your experience in the night in south of Britain in the 60s and the 70s?
Right, so in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, and people laugh at this, is that we lived in a house we lived in two rooms upstairs in the house, and with my mom and my brothers and sisters. And we had a gas light, can you believe that? So, and then later, many, many years later, I took my mum to a museum to see the 1950s house to just see how far behind we were with everybody else in terms of the conditions that we were living in. So that was quite a shock as an adult to realise because we just accepted it. So our living conditions weren't great, but I don't remember us having an awful time. But it just means that we were like 10 years behind everybody else. Of living in a house that was freezing cold, which we always kind of suffered with. And subsequently, the street we lived in was demolished, so clearly it wasn't the greatest place. Sort of thinking about politically and what was going on, I just remember being called names, racist names, every day. It was just constant. You step out the door, go to the shops, not so much at school, but just generally walking around. I grew up in Balham. And I just remember you just took it, you just accepted that that was going to be the case. Um, the 1960s, and I remember the family being very close. So aunties and uncles and everybody being around all the time. We had to go to church on Sundays. That was something that had to happen. I just remember us being quite close as a family. So whatever went on outside of that was like a different world. And once we all got together and we were in the family and friends coming around, it was all quite good. So personally, um, I've got really fond memories of the 60s, but outside of that, just being out and about in society, I just remember feeling, people don't like me and I don't quite understand why. So that was the 1960s really. And then I think the biggest shock as I got into doing my GCSEs and the careers lady came to school to talk to us about careers. And she said that's when we started to realise that if your parents were not born in Britain, there were certain jobs you couldn't apply for. And we were told that we couldn't apply for jobs even to work in British Home Stores, so that was like a department store, unless our parents were actually born in Britain. So I thought, wow, I was looking forward to going and getting my Saturday job in British Home Stores, but I can't even apply now. So it meant that all of a sudden you realise that I realised the opportunities for me were going to be different to everybody else. But I think I never really took it too seriously because I was quite clear about what I wanted to do. So that's, I think, the late 1960s when I started to kind of really realise that why my life chances and my friends' life chances in school could possibly be different.
Often finding out all these kind of things, did it drive you to become an activist at any point in your life?
Um, Not really, because I think a lot of the things that I came across around activists were American, and to be honest, I didn't really relate to what was going on in America at that time to my personal life. I was busy trying to find out what there was on my doorstep so that I could, live my life. So like I say, I wanted to go out and listen to my own kind of music that I liked. So we went to the places where we could hear it. I did get a Saturday job because I was determined I was going to go and get my Saturday job so I can go and shop and buy whatever clothes I wanted to buy. My mother really was a real driver for education. So I was very, very focused on making sure that I got my qualifications. So I think I was so focused on myself of trying to continue to be happy as I was. And I was aware of the politics of it because it was things like I remember I had to open a bank account when I got my first job, and I went into a shop in Oxford Street to write a cheque, and it caused all kinds of problems because they wouldn't accept my cheque. And that's when I start to think, well, I'm working for this amazing company, publishing house, a very major publishing house, earning good money. I've opened my bank account, and the shop won't even accept my cheque. This is after all the obstacles I had to go through to get that job in the first place. So but I think those kind of things just spurred me on, because I think of the racism that I experience in society on a day-to-day basis, I didn't expect anything different, to be honest. So I just used to kind of find ways round over under these hurdles just to make sure that I achieved what I wanted to achieve, because my mother was really keen on me having the best life I could have, and that's what she always kept on saying. So I just needed to focus on that for her, but also for myself, because I could see what was happening to everybody else. So I think politically probably I was just striving to push the boundaries and achieve what hadn't been achieved. So when I had my first job as a PA to the director of a publishing house, that never happened anywhere, you know. And then I went on to work as a PA in the press office at British Gas, and I must have been one of the handful of black staff in this huge organisation working at, you know, director level in an organisation. So I've always striven to be at that level, to be doing things and in places where normally you wouldn't see people. So politically, I suppose personally I was driven like that. My second job, I worked for international personnel, and that came about through the Black Panther movement, which I was aware of, but not part of, and that was in Brixton. So there were quite a few people that were activists at that time, and taking on board what was going on in America. So I was aware of Martin Luther King and all those things. And so the Black Panther movement had people in it who had interests in different strands, and there's somebody who had an interest in the strand in employment. So they set up International Personnel, which was the name of the organisation, which is part of the Martin Luther King Foundation. And their sole purpose was to find employment for black people. And they'd found me my first job in the publishing house. So I went back to them and said, I'm looking for another job now. And they said, well, come and work for us. So that's when I was faced on a day-to-day basis of trying to help people to find work. It was so stressful, so pressurised, but I was so determined to help people because I knew how difficult it was for me. And I'd done and achieved what I meant to at school, and a lot of these people didn't. And I was aware of a lot of them, many people would have not got the education they should, because they were placed in these schools for educational subnormal children. And they wanted to leave home and everything. So I worked really hard to do that. And then we did qualifications. So I got a sociology degree, which required support other people to come on and take that course. So I was actively part of making that politically driven organisation run. But then I was aware that we were part of other things. So his name was Boateng, I can't remember now, and he was a lawyer in Brixton. So when you had things like the New Cross fire, and there were things kicking off in Toxteth and all those kind of places, they would have discussions about all these things all the time. So you'd be around and hear what the conversations were being said and how they were going to decide how they were going to respond to it and to use the media. So I was part of all of that kind of happening, which when I think back now, I can kind of see the importance of all of that, and you see sort of markers of it down later on. And just things when things were happening around the riots, because we had the riots that kind of happened a number of times in my lifetime. And you can almost see what was going on, experience what was going on at the time, and you could feel the pressure building to the point where people just felt, look, we can't take any more, and things happened. So I think just my day-to-day existence was political without even being part of any kind of organised activism, but I was well aware of what was going on. As I got older, so I think probably, 19 or so, and that's when you're starting to see, particularly amongst the young men, mental health starting to creep in. And it was a whole mystery about all of that, what was happening, and when people went off, where did they go, and when they came back, they weren't quite the same person. So that was all a bit of a mystery, really, what was happening there, but that was quite significant, becoming significant as an experience.
How do you feel about the society now compared to then in the 70s? Do you think it's changed, or do you think that there is some sort of improvement compared to how it was in the 70s between not just black people, but Asians as well as whites? Do you think that there is some sort of change?
Well, I think, I mean, Brexit has really brought everything to home now and made everything clear, and you can see that people still think of Britain as in the old days when they had the empire, but that doesn't exist anymore. And all of a sudden, you've got all these people in this country, and where are they going to go, and who's going to be allowed in, and who isn't. And of being of Caribbean heritage, you can see the difference, I think, from people from the Caribbean and people from Asia and people from Africa, where people have lived with their culture and can think of that going back centuries and centuries, but people from the Caribbean don't have that. You know, our heritage goes back. I can think of my parents and probably my grandparents in some instances, though I personally didn't know my grandparents. So we don't have that level of foundation. So that it just feels as though in community, if you look at societies, different people are achieving at different levels. So it almost feels, I think sometimes amongst the Caribbean community, that we kind of, my parents came in the 50s and some before in the war, but you just feel, well, what's the legacy of us being here, and what's the recognition of the role that we played in building the society that we have. And you know, when my daughter started school, I remember having exactly the same conversations with the education system, saying, my daughter is going to achieve her 5 GCSE so that she can go to college. And I'm thinking, but this is like 1990, and my parents had that conversation in the 1960s. Has nothing really changed in that sense? So I suppose things have become more sophisticated, of course. I still feel that things haven't changed in terms of people feeling insecure in society. People still feel insecure, and if I talk to my nephews and nieces who range from teens up to their 30s, and a lot of them will feel insecure in terms of employment or housing or education for themselves or their children, which that's exactly the same as it was in the 1950s. But for other communities, they seem to be able to get on and get their degrees, and so for the Asian community and African community, they seem to be, or that's how it comes across, as you know, they're really kind of striving and stepping in and getting more of the benefits than probably people who came from the Caribbean. So have things changed? Yes, things are changed, because you know, Sadiq Khan is our mayor of London. And London is a very diverse place, but I think if you step outside of London, I don't go out of London that much, but I do sometimes, you know, it's a very different place. So I can only speak for London and say, yeah, it's a very different place than it was. But for England and the UK as a whole, I'm not sure how much things would have changed. And I think for those communities, you know, they're experiencing poverty with the recession and the current economic climate. So they probably may feel that things haven't changed much either for them.
Okay, thank you.